Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to the presentations today. My topic is, as you can see, the return of the PK man. The PK man, I see I'm going to have to get behind this table in order to adjust the slides.
We can move the mic.
I'll just leave it here. I'll stay back here.
You'll stay back there.
Well, I've got to press the button.
Yeah, that's true. You got it.
Okay.
We're going to do that then. We'll
I'll keep this, though.
get you that, all that good
Okay.
stuff. Okay.
I know it feels like I'm hiding back here.
No, but we're all used to lecturing to these folks, and they'll be
Yeah.
happy to have you do that. So.
The PK man is named Ted Owens. He's a person that I did a field study project with. It ran for 10 years from the time I met him in 1976 until he died in 1987. So my talk today is going to have two phases. The first phase will be one in which I summarize the highlights of that 10-year field study. The second phase, I'm going to talk about events that have occurred in the last year that have given me reason to believe that he might be communicating from the other side. Not only communicating from the other side, but continuing the kinds of psychokinetic demonstrations that he did while he was alive in his, what Robert Bigelow likes to call his container. So, there. You can see my book, The PK Man, on the left. It was published in the year 2000. It took a long time to get the book published. The first draft was written in 1979. It was originally rejected by a publisher who said, it's not a very good work of fiction. And I realized if the publisher didn't understand it was a true story, the world isn't ready for it yet. The manuscript sat in my basement for 20 years before I felt that I could begin to release it. And now I can begin to tell you some of the things that have happened subsequently. There's his picture. His book, How to Contact Space People, published in 1967, as I recall. He was born in 1920. An interesting man. He actually worked as an assistant to J.B. Rhine at the parapsychology laboratory at Duke University in the 1940s. Now, in 1976, in February, I was invited to go to SRI International, where my friends Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ were beginning to do their research in remote viewing. And they showed me how to do remote viewing. I had a very successful experience there. But what was really exciting them, all the talk in the laboratory was about this fellow, Ted Owens. At the time, they had achieved a lot of notoriety for their work with Uri Geller. It was written up in Time magazine and I think in Nature. But they kept getting these letters from Ted Owens, who said, why are you wasting your time with this Israeli psychic? I'm the world's greatest psychic. You should be working with me instead. And of course, they ignored him. And they were being funded at the time by the CIA. And the last thing they wanted, they were already embarrassed by all the publicity Uri Geller was generating, and they didn't want another psychic who was out for publicity, as Ted Owens appeared to be. But he sent them another letter. He said, I'm going to prove to you that I'm the world's greatest psychic. He said, there was a drought in California. I don't know if any of you remember the drought of 1976, but it was serious. People used to say, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. I mean, we weren't flushing our toilets. It was that kind of a drought. And all the newspapers said, no end in sight to the drought. But Ted Owens sent them a letter As I recall, it arrived at the end of January 1976. He said, I'm going to end that drought. He said, and you will know that I ended it because your local newspaper is going to run a headline story saying that the drought is over. And furthermore, there's going to be every crazy kind of weather, including snow, sleet, hail. It almost never snows in the San Francisco Bay Area. And there will be UFO sightings. He said, that's one of my trademarks. Well, as you can see from this headline, all of that happened a few days later. So Puthoff and Targ by that time had a big file on this guy. And here I was, a promising young graduate student. And so basically they said, Jeffrey, would you please take this out of our office so we don't have to think about him anymore? Somebody should follow up, and you're the candidate. So I began investigating Ted Owens at that time, and I continued that investigation until he died. I can only cover a few of the highlights, but there were many other events of this nature that occurred. And he used to tell me, in fact, it was his request, that back in those days, people referred to all the young children bending spoons and forks as mini Gellers. And they talked about spoon bending as the Geller effect. And he said, you know, it's just as easy to affect large-scale systems as it is to bend a spoon or a fork. And that was what he specialized in. Weather systems, power blackouts, UFO sightings, tornadoes, earthquakes, and hurricanes. He said he hoped that someday in the future people would refer to psychokinetic influence of such large-scale events as the Owens effect. Now, this is a letter from Max Fogel. He was the director of science and education for Mensa, the organization of high IQ people. Ted Owens was a member of Mensa, and he told Max Fogel, I can make UFOs appear. And so Max Fogel, they did a study. Ted Owens said, I'm going to make a UFO appear within a certain time frame, within a certain geographical area. And Max Fogel is attesting that this happened, and here's the newspaper story. It was seen by and reported by police. So this was part of the file I acquired. And when I met Ted Owens, I met him at the University of London at the conference sponsored by an organization similar to this one. I don't think it's active any longer, called the Parascience Foundation. Owens was a speaker. They had heard about the drought, ending the drought in California. There was another drought in London at the time. It ended the day Owens arrived in London. But I asked him, wait, I'm jumping ahead. I asked him if he would create UFO sightings for me. That was my interest. Here's another affidavit I found in the file. This is written by an attorney, Sidney Margulies. At the time, Ted Owens was working in a law office in Philadelphia. He was a high-speed typist hired by the law office, and he was one day taking a little break. He's in the stairwell, and the attorney, Sidney Margulies, is in the stairwell with him. It's an overcast day. There's no lightning. There's no rain. And Ted Owens said to the attorney, you know, I can make lightning strike anywhere. He said, pick a spot. So the attorney said, yeah, see the bridge over there, the Camden Bridge? Why don't you make lightning strike in that direction? Ted Owens pointed his finger like that, and within about a minute, a bolt of lightning came out of the sky in that direction. I've interviewed Sidney Margulies about this twice, I think 10 years apart each time, and he remembers the event vividly. It's the kind of thing you don't forget when it happened. I think it's one of the best examples of to answer the question, is he doing psychokinesis or is he just predicting these events? But when someone says to you, make lightning strike there, and then it does, that's much more likely psychokinesis than precognition. So I ran this little study in 1976. I called it the San Francisco experiment. I said, produce a UFO for me. He said, I'll produce 3 of them. And we got 2 that I'm aware of. And I had to scramble because I didn't think it was going to happen this quickly. And I'm in school. I'm trying to do this appropriately. So I actually arranged for people in San Diego, a city about the same size and geography as San Francisco, to monitor the area around San Diego, because we didn't know how many UFOs are appearing in these areas anyway, naturally. It turned out there were no UFOs in this, reported in the San Diego area during that time. And there was one very dramatic abduction reported in the San Francisco area. And then one day I was on the phone with Ted Owens, and he said to me, Jeffrey, I can feel it coming. He said, this is going to be big. He said, this UFO is going to be seen by hundreds of people. It's going to be photographed, and the photograph will be published on the front page of one of your local newspapers. Well, that happened 5 days later. There's the Berkeley Gazette. It happened right over the campus of Sonoma State College, 50 miles north of San Francisco, within the specified area. The art department of the college was sponsoring Stephen Pileski, an aerial artist flying his airplane with smoke trailing out the back, making designs in the sky. It was an art exhibit. So the whole art department is out there with their cameras. A UFO appeared right in his airspace. He saw it 3,000 feet above the campus, a lozenge-shaped UFO, very much like the Tic Tac UFOs that have been reported recently. And it was not only photographed and seen by hundreds of people from the ground, it was videotaped. And the videotape was broadcast on the Channel 9 Evening News in San Francisco. So you can imagine he was pretty full of himself after that happened. And I was on the phone with him, and he's very proud of what had happened. And I said to him, well, you know, you've only caused 2 sightings so far. At that point, he slammed the phone down. Within minutes, I started to feel ill. I began to get, you know how you get a scratchy throat before you get the full sore throat? But by the time you feel it scratching, you know it's going to happen. You're going to get a bad sore throat. And that's what happened within about a half hour after the phone had been slammed down on me. 15 minutes after that, he called me back again. He said, Jeffrey, I will never do that to you again, without specifying what he had done, or what I thought he might have done. And interestingly, the sore throat lifted immediately. So there were many negative events associated with Ted Owens. He was the kind of person who, for example, would walk into the offices of the major newspaper in San Francisco, the San Francisco Chronicle, and say, I have an announcement. I am the great PK man, and I'm here to end the drought. And the guards in the lobby would boot him out. And then he would say, well, I guess I better teach these people a lesson. And many negative lessons occurred. In that instance, after he got kicked out of the offices of out of the lobby of the San Francisco Chronicle, one of his trademarks was lightning strikes. He had a logo, which is a UFO with a bolt of lightning coming out of it. Shortly after that, 300,000 acres burned in California, caused by 1,000 lightning strikes. Now, he wasn't always accurate. I have in my files 168 examples of these demonstrations he produced. I would say 2/3 of them roughly worked out as he said they would. But I was beginning to lose interest in him by 1985. He was threatening to attack the United States government. He wanted the government to finance him. And he wanted nothing more than to do good work with government support. But the government, of course, ignored him. And on Christmas Eve, 1985, I received a phone call from him that I will never forget. He said to me in his booming voice, "Jeffrey, this is the most important phone call you will ever receive. So it's up to you now. You have to tell the U.S. government not to launch the next space shuttle, because if they do, my UFOs are going to knock it out of the sky." And of course, I ignored him because, amongst other things, I had no relationship with the U.S. government. They weren't about to listen to me. And if I were to tell them not to launch the next space shuttle, yeah. In fact, there were engineers already telling them not to launch the next space shuttle, and they ignored it. But that's what happened. About a month later, the Challenger exploded. It was at that point that I decided I had been ignoring him for too long. He had a training program, and I thought, well, why don't I just take his training program? And I did. I arranged to take his training program. It was 3 days of hypnosis in a hotel room in San Francisco. I had a few friends with me. And he said to me, as we began, I have the whole thing recorded on tape, so I actually have my own words from 1986. He said, "Jeffrey, what do you want to do with this ability?" And I said, "I certainly don't want to do the things you do." I said, "What I would like to do is to become an effective communicator to the mainstream public about the realities of psychic functioning." And it was within a few months of that I launched my first television series, the Thinking Aloud series. And it's really the work that I'm doing today still in the media and doing interviews is a result of all of that. Now, let me without going into more detail of the many adventures involving Ted Owens, I'm going to...
Just a question.
Oh, there'll be time for questions later.
Oh, a clarification.
Yes?
Did he really tell you, did I heard well, that if you don't tell the government, the UFO are going to kick out Challenger from the...
Yeah, I'll answer that question later, but I'm not lying to you. Whatever I said, and that's exactly what I said, is true.
Exactly what you said.
Yes. That's what he said. My UFOs will knock it out of the sky. Now, I know there's all the talk about the O-rings and so on, so that's a lengthy discussion we'll just have to avoid for now. And I will be happy to answer questions after. Last December, to be precise, on December 12th, Ted Owens died in 1987. I hadn't been thinking about him for a long time. He had other things on my mind. I received an email from a New Thinking Aloud viewer named Javier Flores, lived in Germany. And the email was that he's a meditator. He's an in-depth meditator. He was in meditation He had been meditating about half an hour, and he said this image appeared in his meditation. And it seemed like he recognized it was a person. And it seemed like an angry, hostile person. But he said after a while it seemed human, and then after more time, he recognized it as the picture of, or the image of Ted Owens. You saw his picture earlier. And he said he began communicating with Ted Owens. And Ted Owens said, I have a message I want you to pass on to Jeffrey. Tell Jeffrey that I know he wants to talk to me. And if he wishes to reach out to me in meditation, it's up to him. He doesn't have to. And if he does, he doesn't have to continue. But I'll be there. I'll be waiting for him. That was on December 12th. And I thought, maybe I should try to reach out to him. And on December 28th, 2 weeks later, roughly, I felt like I had communicated with him in a meditative state, sort of a hypnagogic state. Sometimes late at night, if I'm awake at night, I will meditate. And it was kind of like that. And what was on my mind at the time, if you put yourself back to last December, what was in the news, of course, was the Ukraine war. And the news was that the Russians were taking out all the power stations in Ukraine so that the Ukrainian people might freeze over the cold winter. And I felt very concerned for Ted, or not for Ted, for the Ukrainians. And I remembered there was a case in the files where Ted Owens created a heat wave in the middle of winter one year, one of his demonstrations. I thought, wouldn't it be great if the Ukrainian people didn't suffer from all of those power stations being disabled by Soviet rockets, not Soviet, Russian rockets. If Ted Owens could create warm weather in Ukraine, and we could do it over a 90-day period starting on December 28th. That was the day I had this meditation. And that very day, I posted a monologue on the New Thinking Aloud channel explaining all of this and saying, well, we'll run it as a test, we'll see, and we can do statistics. That was pretty naive of me, but I did it. So I'm going to share with you now what happened since then. Within a few days, on January 1st, 3 days later, thousands of records were shattered all across Europe. Unbelievable. The people, the meteorologists who track the weather, who track extreme weather, said, this is crazy. Nothing like this has ever happened. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of typical. It's not so different from the thousands of lightning strikes that I mentioned earlier that burned down 300,000 acres in California during one of his demonstrations. I thought, this is characteristic of Ted Owens. But at the same time, to be clear, in my meditation, in my monologue on New Thinking Aloud, I didn't talk about temperature records across Europe. I talked about Ukraine only. This is another map showing all the different temperature records that were broken on January 1st across Europe. Another thing that was in the news in those days is that it was Putin's hope that he would get the European allies who were supporting Ukraine to cave, because they relied on Russian natural gas for heat in the winter. And he could sort of blackmail them, it seemed. However, because of the warm weather all across Europe, it was pretty warm that winter. Some of you may know The ski resorts were closed because the snow was melting. They didn't have skiing in the Alps, for example, in many resorts. And the news was that Putin's efforts to force the Europeans to cave on their support for Ukraine was backfiring. It wasn't working because of the warm winter. Furthermore, people were saying, you know, this warm weather will help end the war in Ukraine because Putin isn't getting the revenues that he wanted to get from the natural gas. So that all seemed positive. And in fact, there was a news article saying, in spite of all their electricity being knocked out, the Ukrainians were getting ready to start exporting electricity over the winter. Now, I worked with an atmospheric scientist, Danny Caputi, to do statistical analysis. It was not easy because the weather is correlated everywhere. I had data points from 30 or 40 weather stations all across Ukraine, day by day. But you cannot treat those as independent from each other. They're all correlated with each other. So at the end of the day, we felt that the best measurement would be to take the average weather for the previous 5 years in Ukraine, and that's the red line in this graph, and compare it with the daily average temperature in Ukraine, the average of all the different weather stations. And as you can see, the blue line is generally higher than the average for 5 years. But I can tell you right now, it was not statistically significant. And Danny Caputi, the atmospheric scientist, said it's a good thing it wasn't, because we're dealing with global warming. The climate is very delicate, and if it had been any hotter, that could have been dangerous for the whole world. So what we have here is a situation in which the results from a statistical point of view are non-significant. In other words, the scientific study I thought I could conduct yielded non-significant results. On the other hand, it probably had a very instrumental effect in not only the comfort of the people in Ukraine, whose power had been largely knocked out, but also an effect on the outcome of the war, the support for Ukraine from all the European allies at the same time. And even if we look at the weather for all of Europe, in spite of the fact that on January 1st, 1,000 temperature records were broken, if you look at the entire 90-day period that I had set up in my mind, the results were non-significant. It would have looked very similar, the graph for all of Europe, as it looks for Ukraine. So I think this might be an example of how a psychic effect, if it's a real psychic effect, can be very instrumental in affecting real-world events without necessarily being statistically significant at all. So, in conclusion, I think there are three major possibilities of looking at that. The first is that Javier Flores and I were both mistaken. We didn't really contact Ted Owens at all. It was a fantasy, and all of the events that I'm describing are chance occurrences. The second option is that the after-death communications were very real, and that Owens himself, who had been dead for 35 years, is about to move on to some other dimension of the afterlife, and this was his way of saying goodbye before he moves on. And the third option, which is one incidentally suggested to me by Robert Bigelow, who has on his own made a deep study of the afterlife, is that Owens wants to redeem himself. He did a lot of negative things when he was alive, but now he's been in the afterlife for some 35 years. He's learned, he's matured, and he hopes to create a scientific record and do more good and for the world. And we should see if he's willing to do other demonstrations that are both meaningful by being helpful to humanity, which was always his interest when alive, when given the opportunity, and also scientifically meaningful. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to present this material to this group, because I'm not sure how to create a challenge for Ted Owens that would be both humanitarian in nature and, if successful, would yield results that could be statistically meaningful and at the same time not damage the environment. He's an expert, at least when he was alive, at influencing large-scale weather systems. But right now, with global climate change, everything is so unstable. I think one has to be extraordinarily careful in doing these kinds of studies with the weather. It would take very little, from what people tell me who are atmospheric scientists and meteorologists, to cross a tipping point. If one isn't careful, that could be dangerous, very dangerous for the whole world. So I favor the third hypothesis. I guess I favor it because I'd like it to be real. I'd like to be able to come up with further challenges if I had something good in mind, and I'm open to suggestions from members of the audience. I would try to reach out to him again in meditation to see what could be done. So thank you for your attention.